Hey, so welcome to another installment of Miss Neal's Corner. You have been assigned this assignment because you did not do so very well on the mandatory a discretionary appeal assignment. So I created this little short video to kind of help explain the concept a little bit better and give you a second opportunity to bring your grade up. Because right now, if you're watching this, yeah, you failed. So appellate jurisdiction, let's just understand that first to make sure that we know that anytime we're talking about appeal, so when I say mandatory appeal or discretionary appeal power, that I'm talking about an appellate court that has appellate jurisdiction. Because in some of your answers, you put trial courts. Trial courts don't have appellate jurisdiction and they don't hear appeals. So an appellate jurisdiction is the power of a court to review a case for error. Okay, so they can only review that case after it has been decided in a trial court. Remember back when I gave you the example of something came up on my screen. There we go. I gave you the example of if you fail for the 6 weeks and you want to appeal that decision to your AP, you have to wait until the 6 weeks is over. Otherwise, you have nothing to appeal. If you don't like your grade during the 6 weeks, then you talk to your teacher and you come up with a plan with your teacher. You don't appeal when there's not a final decision. Okay? So mandatory appeal or mandatory review is when appellate courts must hear all appeals submitted. So that means if somebody submits an appeal to that court and they have mandatory review, they have to hear it. Now, that doesn't mean that they have to invite the attorneys to the court and listen to oral arguments. Pay attention to your appeal process notes so that way you know what I'm talking about right now. That doesn't mean they have to do that, but they at least have to look at that transcript and they have to make a decision based on the transcript and the briefs that were turned in. Okay. Typically, intermediate court of appeals will have mandatory review, such as the U.S. Court of Appeals. It is an intermediate appeals court. And the reason why it's an intermediate appeals court because it's in between the district court, which is a trial court, and the U.S. Supreme Court, which is the highest appeals court for the land. Okay, so they're in between, they're intermediate. And so if it's a federal appeal that originated in a district court, then they have to hear that appeal. Okay. Discretionary review is the ability of a court to choose which appeals they want to hear. So it's different than in mandatory review. Mandatory, you have to hear it. Discretionary, you don't. You get to choose. This is usually reserved for high courts, like the Supreme Court or SCOTUS, like we like to call it for short. A good example, there's been a lot in the news about DACA. Well, there was an appeal petition to the Supreme Court to hear DACA. They refuse to hear it. They don't have to. Okay. So any kind of high court, like a state Supreme Court, is probably going to have discretionary review, meaning they don't have to hear an appeal that's brought before them. But sometimes, there are times, very rare, when discretionary review courts like the Supreme Court or state Supreme Courts will have mandatory review over certain types of cases. For example, the Supreme Court has mandatory review if a case has been previously decided by two federal appeals court and they got two different answers. Okay, so that means if one appeals court at the federal level gave you this answer and another appeals court at the federal level gave you this answer, they're not the same answer. So the only way to settle that dispute is to have the Supreme Court give the final answer. Okay, so they have to hear those kind of cases. Other than that, they don't have to hear it. Okay. At the state level, for example, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, which is one of our Supreme Courts in the state of Texas, so it is the highest level of court for a criminal appeal, they have to hear death penalty appeals. Okay. They can't turn that down. They have to hear that death penalty appeal. Okay, it's a mandatory review situation for them. But all other appeals, they don't have to hear. Okay, so hopefully this will help clear up any confusion that you had about mandatory review and discretionary review. So now it's time for you to do the assignment. Okay, And I want you to find one example of a mandatory review court. Don't give me a scenario. That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking for the name of a court. And also find one example of a discretionary review court. Once again, I am not looking for a definition. I am not looking for an example or a scenario. A scenario. I am looking for you to give me a court name that has mandatory review or discretionary review. That's all for now.